here at Hudson, and I served as Undersecretary of Defense in the George W. Bush administration. Today's panel on export controls has been generously underwritten by OCR Services, Inc. I'm pleased to welcome Mr. Raj Boveja, OCR's president. We appreciate the support. This is an important moment in the field of export controls. It's a field that is at the intersection of national security policy, technology, and business. The way the U.S. government regulates export of military and security-related technology affects a lot of important things. The risks that our military forces will face in the field, the health of the U.S. defense industrial base, the quality of our defense relationships with allies and partners all over the world, the commercial interests of American companies in fields involving many billions of dollars per year of trade and investment. And the Obama administration is right now in the process of rolling out its ideas on export control reform. And I'm pleased to say we have an authoritative panel to discuss its new proposals. We have Mr. Michael Froman, Deputy National Security Advisor, Mr. William Schneider, the former Undersecretary of State, Mr. Brant Pascoe, a former member of the National Security Council Task Force on Export Control Reform. I'll give a little more information about the background of each of our panelists when I call on them to speak. And let me first tell you what the structure of today's discussion will be. First, Brant Pascoe will give a very short primer, as it were, on export controls. I know many people here are interested in the subject with backgrounds in national security affairs rather than as legal experts in the field that can sometimes become quite detailed and even arcane. And so as a way of getting everybody at least basically educated on a few of the fundamentals about export control, I've asked Brant to provide a quick export control 101. And after he does that, we'll ask Mr. Froman to set out the ideas that the administration has for export control reform, and then we'll ask Bill Schneider and Brant to comment on that, and I'll be commenting and questioning along the way, and then we'll have time for questions from you here in the room, and we'll proceed that way. So what I'd like to do first is ask Brant Pascoe to come up and do this quickie version of Export Controls 101, and appreciate your being here. Let me just give a word of background on Brant Pascoe. I mentioned that he was on the National Security Council Task Force on Export Control Reform. He's an attorney. Worked for some years in the Homeland Security Department, and it was from there that he participated in this panel. He has also worked in the Defense Department, which is where I got to know him, and in the General Counsel office there, and in the office of the Deputy Undersecretary for International Technology Security. And it's a pleasure to welcome him to Hudson.
Thank you, Doug. It's a privilege to have the opportunity to work with you again. And to my other panelists, I really appreciate you doing this. Doug had asked me to give a 3-minute primer on export controls, so we're going to try to keep it to that. To set up the basic structure that most of you will be familiar with, but some of you may not be. This is the current state of affairs. There are 3 main licensing agencies for export controls. Those are the Department of the Treasury, the Department of State, and the Department of Commerce. Now, the Department of Defense is not formally a licensing agency. but their views are in many cases dispositive on whether licenses are issued. So they're a very key player in this. They essentially provide the technical support to both the Commerce and State Departments. There are three main statutes that underpin export controls. The Arms Export Control Act is principally what authorizes the State Department's export control processes. The Export Administration Act, which is lapsed, is the underpinning for the export administration regulations of the Department of Commerce. And the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which is being used to keep the export administration regulations alive and also underpins the Department of the Treasury's Foreign Assets Control regulations. From these statutes grow two principal control lists, which are the United States Munitions List, sometimes also referred to by the broader regulation, the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, which we'll be talking about quite a bit today, and the Commerce Control List, administered by the Department of Commerce under the Export Enforcement Regulations. Now, these two lists, it's important to understand, do not crosswalk to each other well. They have fundamentally different structures, different levels of specificity, and very different sets of definitions. On the enforcement side, there's something of a grab bag of agencies that do work in this area. From Homeland Security, Immigrations and Customs Enforcement has broad authority over most of this. The Federal Bureau of Investigation has jurisdiction with cases that involve counterterrorism or counterintelligence functions. Commerce's Office of Export Enforcement has authority with relation to the Commerce Department licenses. DoD has a role to play in principally through the Office of the Inspector General and subordinate agencies, and the Treasury Department as well. So it's something of an area where all can play, and it isn't especially well coordinated between them. I'm not going to say very much about export control reform at this time because I'd be stepping on Mike's talk, but it's safe to say, I think, that export control reform is something every administration tries to do and generally fails at. When I was a junior political appointee in the Bush administration in the Pentagon, we tried mightily with National Security Presidential Directive 19 to reform the effort, and after about a year and a half of effort, I think it kind of collapsed under its own weight. Came back with two smaller attempts, NSPDs 55 and 56. But I think that the Obama administration deserves an enormous amount of credit for carrying this effort forward with even a higher level of intensity than what we had done in the Bush administration. With this particular effort, which was set in motion, goodness, in August of 2009 with Presidential Study Directive 8, it's a broad effort with a number of different agencies. What's different about this, perhaps, was that we were selected for this task force as technical experts rather than owners of turf. We were told to take off our agency hats or go home. And the point there was that we were responsible to NSC deputies to fix this system. We knew enough about the system that we knew its warts, but hadn't designed them and perhaps didn't even like them very much. And it made for an interesting and kind of unique interagency effort. And that's all I have to say on that. I hope that was close to the 3-minute mark. And I'll turn it back to you, Doug.
Nicely done.
Thank you. I should have mentioned that Brent is now an attorney at K. Scholler, a law firm here in Washington. And I'm glad he reminded us of that.
We noticed that.
Now, Michael Froman is the Deputy National Security Advisor for International Economic Affairs. And in that capacity, among other things, helps prepare the major economic summits that the President attends, the G8, G20 summit meetings. He's served in a number of roles at Citigroup before his current responsibilities, and before being in Citigroup in the 1990s during the Clinton administration, he served as Chief of Staff and Deputy Assistant Secretary for Eurasia and the Middle East at the U.S. Department of the Treasury. He also worked at the White House as Director for International Economic Affairs at the National Security Council and National Economic Council. And he was educated at Princeton, Oxford, Harvard Law School, where I believe he was a colleague of President Obama on the Harvard Law Review. And we're delighted to welcome him here to Hudson.
Thank you, Doug, for that introduction. The one part you left out was that when I was here in the 90s at the White House, we also had a failed attempt to do export control reform. Dan Poneman, who was the senior director at the time, and I and many others in the interagency worked on that. And I guess no good deed goes unpunished. If you don't get it right the first time, you're required to come back and do it again. So thank you for having us here. It's a pleasure to be on the panel with all of you. I just want to say one word about the task force that Brant was a member of, and we have Brian Nielsen here, who is the chair of the task force and is really the leader and hero of this whole effort, because as Brant said, this was an experiment in interagency policy development that I think is quite unique in terms of getting people together, telling them to leave their hats at home, their turf hats, and getting them to work on developing, in their view, based on their experience, the best possible export control system. And it really is, I think, the civil service at its best. And it's no surprise that they've been nominated and have been finalists for the Service to America medals that the Partnership for Public Service puts in. So they've done an enormous amount of work on this. Let me just add to what Brant said, just to set the context. The export control system, as you all know, is a myriad of different systems, multiple agencies, multiple statutes, different rules, different approaches, being applied by different departments who are operating on different IT systems, or in the case of one of the licensing agencies, on no IT system at all, really on a fax-based system. And as a result, nobody has a single view into who's being granted or being denied what license for what purpose, neither on the licensing side nor on the enforcement side. And it's that bit of a mess that's grown up over several decades that we try to take on. As Brant said, virtually every president going back, I think, to Kennedy has tried one export control reform effort or another. And I think what made the difference this time, or what is making the difference this time, is really getting off to a very good start, including by the support of former Secretary of Defense Gates, who came into government or stayed in government with the view that we fundamentally needed a different system, and was a strong proponent, along with Secretary Locke, with Secretary Clinton, and the enforcement agencies. And his view was, if we care about the crown jewels of American technology that are important to our national security, we need to build higher walls around a smaller yard. That if we're trying to control for everything, we will effectively be inadequate in control for nothing. And that was the motivating factor behind this. And so out of that process, and Brant mentioned a year-long study that Brian Nielsen and others led, and that went through the deputies, the principals, and ultimately to President Obama, we came out with the recommendation that the new system be based on what we call the four singularities: a single list, a single licensing system, single licensing agency, a single IT system, and a single primary enforcement coordinating agency. And that is the ultimate goal of this reform effort. We've broken it down into three parts. The first phase is to lay out how the lists are to be developed and how to harmonize our practices and policies and how better to coordinate our efforts among the agencies. And that's what President Obama laid out in August 2010, just about a year ago. Phase two, which has been in place since then, has focused on implementing that vision, particularly through what can be done through executive action. And I'd underscore that we think about 80% or so of the reform can be done through executive action, and it's that we're very much in the midst of. And phase three, which includes establishing a single licensing agency, requires legislation, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. Where we are is trying to take a common sense approach to the implementation of these reforms to make our control system more clear and more concise. And in our view, this is important to meet national security requirements. But let me say what export control reform is not about. It's not about promoting exports. This is separate and distinct from the National Export Initiative that the President launched. It is fundamentally about national security, not about promoting exports. Nor is it a decontrol effort. Certain items may be decontrolled, but that's not its purpose. The purpose is to focus on where our focus should be in terms of controlling and to build a system that has coherence around that. And in that regard, we want to make sure our system protects the most critical technologies while maintaining the competitiveness of U.S. critical industries. And I just want to raise one issue that I hear sometimes in the press or in the criticism of this. There is no tension, in our view, between economic interests and national security interests here. This is not something to be balanced. It's not a balancing act. In our view, national security requires two things. One is focus on the most critical technologies and building those higher walls, including strengthened enforcement around the most critical technologies. And the second is maintaining the competitiveness of key U.S. industries, key to our military, key to our intelligence capabilities. If U.S. firms are going to find themselves designed out of products because of our system, if they're going to find themselves unable to export from here due to our system and move abroad, we're going to lose our capacity to source from those industries. We're going to lose control of where those products go. We'll lose our ability to track where they go, and all of that damages U.S. national security. So in our view, getting that right and ensuring that our critical industries remain competitive here in the U.S. is very much part of the national security requirement. Last week, Chief of Staff Bill Daley spoke at the annual Commerce Department Export Control Conference and talked about three of the recent reforms that we announced. The first was a new licensing policy that was rolled out last month called Strategic Trade Authorization, or STA. Doug warned me when I got up here not to use acronyms or to speak English instead, but in the export control world, that's as close to English as one can get. And this allows us to tighten our compliance and re-export requirements among some countries, while at the same time making licensing more efficient with the 36 countries that are either our closest allies or are members of the 3 export control regimes or meet some other critical criteria. The second announcement we made was just a couple of weeks ago, and that was to roll out the next phase of the final phase, really, of the methodology by which we are going to execute this reform effort. Some of you recall in December, we put out our Bright Line paper. And that Bright Line paper was the paper that said how we were going to determine whether something was on the State Department's list or the Commerce Department's list. The paper and the rule that we rolled out a couple of weeks ago takes that one step further and says for those items that will be moved from the State Department's list to the Commerce Department's list, where they will benefit from more flexible licensing, how will that movement be done? How will they be received by the Commerce list? And what licensing policies will be applied to them when they come to the Commerce list? And in that context, we took one category of items from the State Department list, Category 7, which is tanks and military vehicles, and applied the new rules to that one category to show it as an example. And just to summarize the impact of that, we think that of the 12,000 items that fall into Category 7 or were licensed in Category 7, 11,000 of them will move from the State Department list to the Commerce Control list. Of that, about 50% will be eligible automatically for license-free treatment under this new licensing policy that we rolled out in June, the STA policy. Of 35% of that will require initially a license, but then will be eligible for STA treatment to those same close allies and regime members. And finally, the last 15% will fall to the bottom of the list and not require any license altogether. And as a result, we think that about 55% of the licenses that had previously been required for that category may be eliminated over the long run. Why is this important? We think it improves our interoperability with our allies. We think it will deal with the design out concern of U.S. components being designed out of products being produced. And thirdly, it will allow us to focus our resource on these items. I just want to make just a few points about this. I mean, you all know the stories of, the Dutch fighter plane that needed a spare part in a unit in Afghanistan, where there were Danes and Norwegians in the same unit who had the spare part. These were all U.S. parts, and the Danes and Norwegians could not give the Dutch the spare part without coming back to Washington for a license. I mean, the stories that our military tells, Admiral Mullen and others, about the impact of our current export control requirements on interoperability, on cooperation in the field, are quite troubling, and that is a primary motivation for doing this. Now, there will still remain some very strict restrictions and criteria, even for Category 7, even in the case of something around military vehicles. We still have the Tiananmen sanctions in place, and there's nothing in here, nothing in our reform effort that will go towards undermining the Tiananmen sanctions or allowing us to provide goods to support Chinese military development. And that's been a concern that's been raised in some quarters. We have the other sanctions regimes, terrorism and Iran, other sanctions regimes that remain very much in place. But for the bulk of the licenses, to the bulk of the countries who are our closest allies and regime partners, we believe when this process is done, it will be a fundamentally different, more efficient, and more usable system. We couldn't have gotten here without a lot of input from the outside. We asked outside commentators to help us develop the proposed control list for our review. We're asking for comment on the proposed rules. I understand one commentator, one person has provided 1,400 pages of comments himself, but we very much look forward to getting that commentary from all interested parties and experts, because we very much want this to be a product that can that has the best input possible. One more word about the transition, and then let me close about legislation. On the transition, as I mentioned, we could not have gotten here but for the support of Secretary Gates at the beginning and throughout the administration. And obviously Secretary Locke has been a key proponent of this as well. But we expect fully that we're going to keep up the momentum going forward. I've already had conversations with Secretary Panetta about this, and he's indicated he's exactly in the same place as Secretary Gates is. And with the Senate's approval, hopefully Secretary Bryson will join that as well. Finally, let me just say a word about Phase 3 of our implementation plan, which goes to the legislation. We envisage a single license agency, a merger of the two control lists, and the consolidation of two of our export enforcement units, all of which has to be done through legislation. We have draft legislation that is nearly ready to go. There are draft bills floating around in Congress, and again, as we move forward, we look forward to the input of this community, and obviously working with our colleagues on the Hill to try and advance that agenda. And with that, Doug, let me turn it over to Bill.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. And now I'd like to call on Bill Schneider to deliver his comments. There, in this field of export controls, but in many others, Bill Schneider, I think, is one of Washington's wisest and also wittiest and most sardonic heads in the whole national security establishment. He's the president of International Planning Services, Inc. He's an adjunct fellow here at the Hudson Institute, and has background in all relevant parts of our national security apparatus. And he was a staffer on the House side and the Senate side on Capitol Hill. He served as associate director of the Office of Management and Budget, as Undersecretary of State for Security Assistance, Science, and Technology. He has chaired the Defense Sciences Board, the Defense Science Board and has done work on the State Department's Defense Trade Advisory Group, and has his PhD from New York University. Bill thoroughly understands this field and understands the long and difficult history that export control reform has had. And I'll be very interested to get his comments on what the Obama administration is now proposing, and also what your thoughts are about how it's likely to be received on Capitol Hill. Bill Schneider.
Thank you, Doug, and it's always a pleasure to come to Hudson Institute, and even if I have spent 30 years being sentenced to export control, I'm even happy to come here and speak on this subject. In the domain of serial confessions, I'll also say that when I served in the Reagan administration, we also tried to reform the arms transfer process, the original statute only being a few years old, but its limitations had already appeared. We crashed and burned. We didn't even get an NSPD out of it. It was just seen as too hopeless to actually try and make the change. But in thinking about this subject, I'm reminded of an experience I had when I was working on the professional staff at Hudson Institute, and I was involved in a study of the subject of aerial interdiction in Vietnam. And after studying the problem for some time, I spent an afternoon with Herman Kahn, then the director, and we had a discussion about this. And I expressed my disappointment that despite the fact that this was a very appropriate military operation, the way it was actually being executed was really made it hard to imagine that this was worth doing. And so he came back to me and said, Herman himself, having been very involved in the study of interdiction during the Korean War, and he, in his usual aphoristic speaking style, said, in public policy, anything that's worth doing is worth doing badly. And I tend to think that about the export control function, say, having been sentenced to it for 30 years, that it is very much a necessary function, but I take a somewhat more radical perspective than Mr. Froman and others, saying that the way the Arms Export Control Act is managed has in fact become orthogonal to U.S. National security interests. And this perspective has been intensified by my own experience in recent years in working with the Department of Defense, and in particular advanced technology. And I have a few points about why I think this is the case. Mainly the implementation of the statute is missing the mega trends that are underway, and indeed have been underway for a quarter of a century in the defense establishment. The underlying model of the AECA is a buyer-seller relationship between the U.S. and buyers abroad, that the U.S. has all the technology. We need to protect it and prevent its leakage abroad, and that model has dictated a very robust set of restrictions that produce the kind of anomalies that Mr. Froman referred to about the way it's made transfers to allies very difficult. Second point is that the increasing complexity and the system of systems character of most defense products has increased the preference for government-to-government transactions for arms sales, and that again is orthogonal with the underlying AECA model, which tended to imagine much heavier emphasis on direct commercial sales.
Let me just say, the AECA is the Arms Export Control Act.
Yeah. Right. It was carefully concealed behind the K. Scholler logo. And perhaps one of the most important things that I think is really a powerful trend that is the Arms Export Control Act has difficulty capturing is that the defense sector is no longer the source of the enabling technologies that create military capabilities. The Chinese case is a good example where they have very little direct access to advanced military technology from either Europe or the U.S., but their particular strategy of defense investment, which is to find the seams and vulnerabilities in U.S. and allied military capabilities and pour investment into those areas, is dependent almost entirely on military applications of advanced civil sector technology. This is a very important phenomenon, and we can go into it in more detail later. The way in which the defense market has evolved and the underlying technologies that support it creates a problem for the implementation of the Arms Export Control Act because of the underlying models that were built into its legislative history. There's really no good process for the AECA to adapt to some of these fundamental changes in defense technology, industrial practice, and military operations. In the past several weeks, we've had also good insight into the fact that military operations are likely to change fundamentally with the introduction of non-kinetic technologies, that is computer network attacks and related activities that don't involve the use of traditional military equipment. This phenomena of the way in which advanced military technologies have been largely dominated by these civil technologies has been pretty well understood for about the past 15 years or so. The Defense Science Board did a study in the mid-90s in a sort of hypothetical speculation of if you had a $10 billion per year budget, and you only had access to Radio Shack and Walmart and things of that sort, what kind of a military capability could you build? And the answer was a very impressive military capability, and without any access to either technology controlled by the International Traffic in Arms Regulations or classified technology. And as Mr. Froman has mentioned, the sort of Cold War mindset that's built into the AECA has really inhibited our ability to have really effective alliance relationships, and that even goes for circumstances where we have recently created a treaty-based relationship between the UK and Australia, which, while it has been implemented, it has been ratified. The implementing regulations are so restrictive that the treaties are largely unimplemented. Well, in thinking about why the serial confessions of failure have been necessary on the Arms Export Control Act, or say in revising the Arms Export Control Act, I think it's necessary to look at some institutional views. I have found, as working in various parts of the bureaucracy, that there isn't any particular malice towards defense exports, but really an underlying institutional problem that is afoot here. As mentioned, there has been this serial failure, and several administrations who fully understand that the Act has not able to meet our needs. Secretary Gates tried to, and I commend him for it, tried to push the resolution of the problem from the top down rather than having the bottom up kind of efforts that had been undertaken in previous administrations. I think the core reason as to why there are all of these unhelpful antibodies every time a significant reform is proposed relates to the approval chain for defense exports. The Arms Export Control Act requires that sales over a certain quantity, a certain dollar value, have to be approved by both the Senate and the House. And it's this procedure under Section 36 of the Act creates an institutional requirement for one of the players, the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, to act. And over the past 25 years, there's been trends in the Congress that have narrowed the scope of its activities, making the Section 36 approvals one of the most important things that the committee undertakes. The Congress has largely abandoned its traditional authorization process, knocking the Foreign Affairs Committee out of much activity there. The House Foreign Affairs Committee doesn't have a role in nominations nor in treaty ratification. So the Section 36 is very important to them and very institutionally important to the House. And as a consequence, the reforms that would have the property that they would reduce the throughput of cases on arms transfers is a significant threat to the institutional role of the Congress in general and the House in particular. And say in some of my own activities and working on this and consultation process, I found the most unrewarding consultation has taken place with the House Foreign Affairs Committee. So I think while the changes that Mr. Froman pointed to are very valuable, these are largely important process changes which should have been made 20 years ago, but haven't been done, and they will add a considerable amount of value. But I think we need to look more fundamentally at the whole of government reform to the arms export problem. It is something that needs to be done well. The proliferation of advanced military capabilities is accelerating at an extraordinary rate because of the way in which the global tech base is now accessible to every country in the world. And while we are now witnessing the impact of this change through the introduction of non-kinetic capabilities through a computer network attack, the field of biology is moving at a Moore's Law pace. The military applications of biology are going to be extensive, profound, and very widely shared. We need a whole of government approach to this, and we need to move beyond simply struggling with process improvements. Thank you.
I guess I get to bookend this one. After doing a brief primer on export controls, Doug had asked me to share some perspective on being part of the task force. And the purpose of this little presentation is really to get to some criticisms that we've heard from some colleagues on the Hill and in industry both, where they've said, you just haven't made the case. Why are we going to all this trouble? And so in the same spirit of doing a brief introduction of what are export controls anyway, I wanted to talk very briefly about some of the basic principles that underpin this. And especially I'm going to talk about commodity jurisdiction determination. At base, I think a principal driver, I should hasten to say that these are my thoughts from my time, and I wouldn't be able to get away with writing a memoir the way that Doug has, but from my time in government, these are some of the thoughts that brought me to, that I brought to the task force. But there are too many things that are controlled that have no reason to be, and the reason for that is that the structure of the system is a problem. There are many, many roads that lead to the ITAR, which is the process, commodity jurisdiction is the process for deciding what is controlled. You have formal commodity jurisdiction. There's also informal commodity jurisdiction, which is In many cases, a license goes into the Department of Commerce and is returned without action because, for whatever reason, the licensing officer simply thinks that it came in through the wrong window and decides not to take action. So you can have government inaction, which results in a commodity jurisdiction putting things to the ITAR. You also have...
You might want to... Does that allow the export to go forward?
No.
Or does it
Well,
block
I'm
the
sorry.
export?
Yeah. In essence, in that situation, industry is faced with applying for a license for the State Department or simply not exporting at all. And so it's as binding a commodity jurisdiction as anything, as a formal one, but it is informal in process. And then you also have private action. Industry by itself, through a self-commodity jurisdiction, simply decides that something is ITAR controlled with no government activity at all. So very quickly, looking at what is supposed to be the basis for what is ITAR controlled. And I'd point specifically to A, in italics there, that something is specifically designed, developed, configured, adapted, or modified for a military application. That's the baseline standard, and it seems like it should be the right standard and easy to apply. But in fact, I'd submit that it is and has always been the wrong standard. And the reason for that is fairly straightforward. First of all, design intent is over-inclusive. There are many, many things that DoD does that simply do not warrant controls on the ITAR. So just to pick on them, I'll throw out the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Health Affairs, which runs the largest hospital network in the United States, I understand. It may meet things that are specifically designed for that hospital system, may meet the ITAR intent test, but in fact should not be controlled, and generally speaking are not. But design intent is also under-inclusive. Consider, for example, the Plowshares program, where we had nuclear weapons, well, nuclear devices, the idea for peaceful purposes, that they wouldn't be used in war, but for hydrocarbon extraction and blasting canals. Well, under a literal reading of the design intent standard, these would not be controlled as munitions items, which is obviously wrong. So from the beginning, this standard has been under stress. But if not design intent, then what? Is a perfectly fair question to ask, and there are a number of things that are used informally in the interagency discussion. There's discussion of military application being broader than military use. This is a challenge because there really is nothing the Department of Defense does not do. The Department of Defense collects garbage and buys garbage trucks, but those are clearly not ITAR-controlled items, so that doesn't give much guidance. Another, immediate tactical utility. Well, indeed, I'd submit that if something hasn't immediate tactical utility, it probably has very little use at all in many cases. Inherently military, questions has the same flaws. The level of control, this comes up frequently. Something has to be ITAR controlled because there isn't an adequate control on the Commerce Control List. And so we're going to make it a munition because in the interagency there's a fight over what the regulations should say. My favorite is purposes for which military sales by the United States are authorized. Right? This just means that it's consistent with the Charter of the United Nations, and I wonder indeed what isn't. How this is a meaningful basis for control is confusing. And so at the bottom line, what we're left with is essentially, in many cases, a pornography standard. That we know it when we see it, and it's a, well, that's all I'll say about that. So maybe it doesn't matter, right? Because after all, there isn't judicial review. The courts have over and over again said that the president has this authority statutorily, the courts will not weigh in. So maybe it doesn't matter, but it's not the case in my view. Inadequate standards cause real problems. Good guys make honest mistakes with serious consequences. Even when there isn't an enforcement, a prosecution, it's incredibly expensive. And bad guys are harder to prosecute. When you have to prove that their intention was to do wrong, it's harder when the standards are difficult to apply. In the summer leading up to the kickoff of the export control reform effort, Judge Easterbrook in the Seventh Circuit put out the Palauan critique of the commodity jurisdiction process. Now, I hasten to point out that this is not legally binding. This is in the dicta of the case, and this doesn't have a necessary applicability to U.S. law or practice. But I believe personally that it's important because it is a scathing critique of the commodity jurisdiction process. A designation by an unnamed official using unspecified criteria that's put in a desk drawer taken only out for use at trial surely should have raised some concerns. But it may be worth pointing out, at least in passing, that sometimes, as I said earlier, it isn't even a judgment by an unnamed official. That would only be for a formal CJ, right? Someone who actually has the authority designated. There's also the informal CJ of government inaction, where things become ITAR simply because the government does not act, or through private action, where industry, in an abundance of caution, self-classifies. But yet these all are lumped in together. So when the task force was asked to look at the question, we would joke that we were looking for export control nirvana, which surely is an elusive place to be. We were told that we had a blank piece of paper, that we should go out and fix the problem and come up with good solutions with no established preconditions of any kind, which I think is important, other than, the national security be enhanced. And I think that we generally agreed that there were some basic things that would be desirable. It should be a predictable system. Industry, frankly, can work even with goofy rules if they're predictable and give a consistent result, although we hope not to do that. They should be flexible. The government needs to be able to capture what it wants, and when new things come up, they should be able to get them. It should be easy to administer and politically accountable, so that senior people are making decisions that have far-reaching impact. And I will, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, say that we've suddenly achieved nirvana with the idea that we needed to have a single positive list. The major benefit of going to this approach is that it is flexible. The government has the ability to promulgate regulations that capture anything that is necessary to capture for national security. But it's also politically accountable because actions are taken at the appropriate high level. The difficulty in doing this is the structure of the system, as I started this brief chat with. And I threw up this graphic to kind of capture the nature of the problem. It's very difficult to say with certainty that any particular thing is not ITAR controlled unless you've received a formal CJ. If you look at the design intent, maybe something where you have clear design intent is the dark core of this chart. The further out you get, it's less clear, have we met this design intent? And the checks are designed to represent a formal commodity jurisdiction determination, where we've said, the white space, this is clearly not ITAR controlled, or the dark space, this is ITAR controlled, where a formal judgment has been made. And what we're seeking to do with a single positive list is convert this problem to that, where we know what's controlled. The four corners are clearly described and defined. And that seems so easy. It should be a straightforward thing, but of course it's not, and the reason it's not is because of the structure of the system. Touching on Bill's comment and the importance of the congressional notification process. We're in a situation here where we are compelled, if you're going to do just a one or two onesies and twosies of taking things off, you can do this, what's called a 38F notification, and tell the Department of State this is no longer controlled. But because it takes over 200 days to do this, it's very difficult. And it doesn't happen very often. To do it in the way we're suggesting it be done, where you rewrite the list as a positive list, you're in essence being required to perhaps prove a negative. If what is controlled is not knowable, and you write a positive list that clearly defines it, what have you removed? It's very hard to say with specificity, with the kind of specificity that seemingly is called for here. So this is my conclusion. In essence, the structural imbalances that underpin that underpin what is on the munitions list create a lobster trap. It's very easy to get onto the International Traffic in Arms Regulations munitions list. It can happen through formal action, informal action, or no government action at all. It's incredibly difficult to get off. It takes very high-level government review and congressional notification. So it's designed to make it very easy to get on and very hard to get off. A goal that at least motivated me when I was coming into this task force was to essentially resolve that. But paying homage to Section 38F of the ITAR is, I think, in my view, the greatest stumbling block to that. Simply because of the difficulty in proving to the satisfaction of the Hill that we understand what is it that is coming off when we don't know necessarily with clarity what is currently on. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Brent. Just make a comment or two. One of the things that I think emerges from these several comments is the common notion that the defense-minded people want tighter controls and the business-minded people want looser controls is not accurate and is not a helpful way of analyzing the problem. I mean, we've heard everybody basically make the point that if you have controls that are ill-designed or overly tight, you're not serving the defense interests of the United States, because the defense interests of the United States are much more complex than simply preventing the export of particular technologies to particular countries. If the export controls are getting in the way of defense industrial cooperation with key allies, you're damaging your alliances. If the defense export controls in this globalized era are persuading investors that if they want to invest in certain technologies, they're better off investing abroad rather than in the United States, so that you can escape this regulatory regime, then they're not serving the defense interests of the United States. And I think it's just it's a really important point in Washington, where people like to try to boil these things down into a simple, which side am I rooting for kind of analysis, to understand that arguing in favor of what you think are tougher export controls is not necessarily a pro-defense position. And now, one question that I'd like to throw out to the other panelists is, especially in light of Bill Schneider's comment that it's extremely difficult to get any legislation passed because of the the built-in institutional interest of the House Foreign Affairs Committee in particular in not doing anything that weakens their hold on these defense export notifications under the Arms Export Control Act. How much of the reform that you, Michael, have been talking about that the administration wants to do, how much requires new statutes, and how much can be done by the administration simply as a matter of executive authority?
Right. Well, virtually everything that we talked about can be done by executive authority, and even this last point that Mr. Schneider mentioned and Brand's also focused on, the notification period, the statutory requirement is for 30 days. We've gotten ourselves in a position where it's taken an average of 200 days, or in, I think, one case over 700 days for them to clear. And that's, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we have submitted 5 transfers over the last couple of years. Category 7 alone involves 11,000 transfers. So this is clearly an issue we're going to need to revisit with Congress as to how they plan to use their 30-day statutory authority. Ultimately, to get to a single licensing agency, a single merged list, as opposed to 2 parallel, similarly structured lists, single enforcement agency, that does require legislation. We have a draft bill. I think there are 2 bills floating around in the House at the moment as well that take it in a somewhat different direction. But if we can get all of the executive action done, including solving this 38F problem in consultation with Congress, that'll go a long way towards achieving the result.
But when you say consultation with Congress, does Congress have to approve what you're proposing within the 30 days, or is the failure to object sufficient to allow your reforms to go forward?
As I understand it, the statute requires 30-day notification, not approval, under 38F. We have gotten in a practice of waiting for 200, 700 days before we do so. But that's exactly the sort of practice that both my colleagues here have focused on that needs to be revisited. But it doesn't require new legislation to do so.
One of the problems that's crept up in the administration of the Arms Export Control Act has been a lot of these practices that are a result of a negotiation between typically the Department of State and the committee about how they will actually behave, even if it isn't required by the statute. The ACA itself is much more permissive than the ecosystem in which it's now embedded, and that's one of the characteristics of the political culture that makes it particularly difficult, and why I know the extraordinary effort that's gone into making these changes, but still until we get some buy-in from the Congress on the need to really change the process, just making these administrative changes, as valuable as they are, is going to cause the exercise to be a victory under the command of General Pierrick, because it will not produce the result we need.
Bill, let me ask you, how are conservatives on the Hill likely to respond to this whole administration initiative? Are they going to be viewing it as the Obama administration doves dismantling militarily useful controls, or are they going to take a different approach?
Well, I think that it's the export control issue has been dominated by institutional factors rather than political or even ideological factors. Certainly, the problem that we've had with space export controls was driven by a concern about the particular circumstances of the transfer to China in the 90s. But that's more an exceptional case. The institutional issues have dominated, and I think it's been decades since the Congress has really engaged this question in a fundamental way. I would say one of the interesting impulses on reform that was brought up by Speaker Gingrich in the mid-90s, but quickly dropped, was a congressional reform that would have created a national security committee that would have integrated foreign affairs and defense into a single committee structure. As I said, there's institutional reasons why that didn't go very far, but I think it tends to get at the problem we've all been discussing, that having an effective system of export controls on the defense capabilities we export. I distinguish that from defense technologies, which I regard as an input, whereas capabilities are an output, which is what we're really interested in controlling. But I think that we need to have a whole of government look at this and to really understand this from a national security perspective, rather than seeing, as is the premise in the Arms Export Control Act, that this is a foreign affairs question.
We'll be happy to open it up to short comments or questions from the floor. If anybody would like to raise one, please. And do we have a microphone for the lady here on this side? Well, no, you do, because we're live streaming the proceedings. Could you please introduce yourself and your affiliation?
Giovanna Cinelli, and I'm with Jones Day. First, I'd like to thank the panel for their comments. They were interesting and insightful. I have a very practical question, though. The Commerce Control List, as opposed to the U.S. munitions list, I think it's a 3-to-1 in length, size, and detail. I've also heard across the board that the Commerce Control List is outdated the moment it's published because of the way technological advances occur, Moore's Law, as was mentioned above, and frankly the way industry goes. I'd appreciate it if the panel could comment on how you intend to address this almost instant obsolescence if everything moves to the Commerce Control List, and what kind of processes will be in place to handle national security as well as foreign policy concerns with that process.
Well, I think it's a very good question, and you're absolutely right. Even just looking at this Category 7 example, it went from really quite a few only a few pages to something that's much longer. That's the downside of going to a positive list, where you actually list what's controlled as opposed to some broad categories that leave ambiguous as to what might or might not fall under the controls. As for its the ability for it to remain dynamic, it's something that we're very much focused on and want a process both by which we can add new items to the list, but also sunset technologies as they enter their second or third or fourth phase, or drop them down in the tiering of priority, and therefore requiring less control. So it's one of those processes we'll be developing as part of the reform, is a process for both adding new things and sunsetting.
The point that you made about the length of the CCL does reflect the dilemma in trying to control the export of technologies, and it's why I suggested that a reformulation of the approach that we take to arms exports, as distinct from exports of I call them civil technologies, is to look at capabilities rather than the underlying technologies, simply because the capabilities that are created are derived from those technologies that have a wide variety of applications. Most of them, in fact, in the civil sector, and it's likely to be an impossible task as we move into these domains I described. The question of non-kinetic military capabilities, the fact that many capabilities that are now performed by electronics will be performed by bioprocesses in the next few years. So you have biosensors, communications, computation, and so forth, that will increasingly displace the classic military equipment in the sense of nomenclatured military products that are created in that way. And we need a different approach to the way we manage the dispersion of technology, because the complete success in the efforts that we have described are not going to prevent Iran and China from posing extremely powerful technology-driven threats to the United States.
there's not a lot I can add to that, but I guess I should say that the length of the lists I don't think is particularly illustrative of a great deal. I mean, I think certainly the more granular you make the list, so you clearly define what's controlled, that granularity adds length. But beyond that, I don't know that there's a lot of significance to it. But on the other question, I think typically commerce control list controls don't establish a ceiling, they tend to establish a floor. So if I say that something, that exceeds a certain performance requirement is controlled, it doesn't matter, as technology can advance and advance, the national security risk of something being uncontrolled wouldn't be all that common. The challenge is to keep the list current so that the control thresholds continue to be relevant, and as national security permits, that they're adjusted upwards.
Yeah, but the military capabilities are not so much dominated by things as they are by algorithms. The algorithms are what converts things into capabilities, and the process for controlling algorithms, unless it's embedded in design for code for military applications, is also not controlled, and because the underlying skill is, of course, very widely distributed, it will prove very difficult to restrict the distribution of these capabilities, even if you get hold of the restrictions as Bront described, with the setting thresholds for export control.
Bill, it sounds to me as if a number of the comments that you made are almost arguing that the entire exercise now of trying to regulate exports for national security reasons may be a vain exercise. And I mean, I'd just like to find out, are you basically saying that the whole field has been overtaken by technology and technological developments and mathematical developments, and it's not worth the effort? Or are there certain areas where it really is worth the effort to license exports?
I do believe that we do need to license exports, and I believe we can do it. My concern is that we're focusing where the light is brightest. The part we can fix is the dreadful administrative consequences of the way the statute has been written, and the lack of a process for really renewal of the underlying mandate for export control. What has happened beneath the readiness of the system to take notice has been the way in which military capabilities are being created has changed, and the changes really picked up pace in the 1980s, and now the changes are so profound, and the new technologies and the new ways of conducting warfare are so extensive that the need for renewal of the mandate for export control is really desperate and not captured by the administrative changes that we're making. So while I live in the world as it exists, I certainly favor the kind of changes that the administration has undertaken, but I think it would be unhelpful if we fail to recognize what is actually happening to defense technology and the way threats are emerging to the United States that are not likely to be captured by this process, and we really do need to begin to take a look at how these capabilities are being created.
Please, this gentleman here in the front.
Anthony Zhang from China's Caixin Media.
Could you speak up, please?
Okay. Anthony Zhang from China's Caixin Media. I have a question for Mr. Furman. I think just now you mentioned that the U.S. is not considering is in the restriction under the Tiananmen sanction. So I just wonder, what, in your idea, should be the realistic expectation from the Chinese government in terms of the U.S. possible reform? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think there are a number of ways in which exports to China will potentially benefit from this reform. For example, if you take Category 7, I mentioned that 15% of what's being transferred from the munitions list to the commerce control list will fall to the bottom of the list and be able to be exported without a license, and in the case to China, to civilian end users. So that's 1,800 items that used to be on the U.S. munitions list, incapable of being exported to China, will now be able to be exported to China. And conceivably, other things on the commerce control list, if there are licensing policies that China is eligible for, to civilian end users and things of that sort, they will be able to apply for a license for technologies that now sit on the commerce control list that used to be on the U.S. munitions list. Where we're not changing things is in anything that crosses the line into supporting China's military development or otherwise would violate Tiananmen sanctions. And that's just, the idea of export control reform is not to increase exports to any particular country. It's to make sure that our export control system is better able to deal with our national security interests, and that's part of our national security interests. And by the way, I would just add, we picked Category 7 for a variety of reasons, but it turns out there weren't many categories in the commerce control list capable of receiving items in Category 7. You pick another category like electronics, where there are a lot of categories, the items will fill those categories, and countries will be able to benefit from the licensing policies that apply to those categories. And so there'll be more of an ability to differentiate between different products depending on what tier of risk they pose and what licensing policies apply to each.
Let me just ask you, as a matter of interagency decision making, when you describe the reassessment of the items on the list that results in X% of items becoming no longer subject to license requirements, is that done by a process that includes the Defense Department, so that the Defense Department is consenting to?
Not only does it include, it's led by the Defense Department. They lead each of the category, for each of the 19 categories, they are the ones leading the group developing the lists. And so they're applying the interagency agreed upon bright line criteria and the criteria for receiving items onto the commerce control list. But it's they who are leading this effort too, and it's their technical experts who are leading this.
Title 7 was a good one to pick because the armored vehicles has a lot of automotive type components, and it's relatively easy to hand those off because many of them are basically beefed up truck components, and so there's not a lot of controversial technology that's reflected in that list. So it's a very good exercise for the process to be able to do it. So I think that was well chosen, but now the low-hanging fruit has been eliminated, and the subsequent steps will probably be more fraught with controversy, simply because they have more items in them that will be more readily identifiable as having a military application.
In the back, the gentleman.
Thank you. Abe Shulsky from Hudson. I was wondering, when you mentioned that you were ultimately looking to go towards a single list with a single agency, you didn't say much about what that agency would be. In other words, would this move to one of the departments that now does it, to State or to Commerce? Or were you thinking of creating a new agency that would handle this unified list? And what kind of charter would it be given in terms of the things it's supposed to take into consideration? Thanks.
Well, I don't want to spoil the surprise when we ultimately do release our legislation. I would simply say it does envisage taking the licensing components from Commerce, State, and Treasury and putting them in a single place, not an existing agency.
Just next door here. Right.
Good afternoon. Remy Nathan with the Aerospace Industries Association. Let me begin with a thank you, Michael, for your leadership in this exercise, Brant, for your contribution beforehand, and I'm sure going forward, and Mr. Schneider, of course, for your ongoing leadership in this area. More of a comment, I suppose, and of course reactions from the panel would be welcome. I would suggest that, consistent with Brant's statement earlier, the aerospace industry, aerospace and defense industry, more than anything else, I think, is looking for the results of this reform to yield clarity and not decontrol. So often we talk about export control reform as an issue of exporting, and we think about large companies. Rather, we lose sight of the fact that the most pernicious effects of the current system is the confusion, the potential liability, both criminal and commercial, that pops up in the industrial base, in the suppliers, who don't understand the system, sometimes find it much easier to import products than they do to actually export their products. And in that regard, I think as well, one other thing I'll finally say, I'd like to suggest that in the industry, we're not expecting a whole raft of capabilities that are being controlled now at the USML level to no longer be controlled at all. More than anything else, I think the value is going to come from those essentially commercial technologies that purely from a wording of a regulation makes people think, well, depending on when it was designed first, maybe it's military, maybe it's commercial, that you'll actually get some clarity in that regard. Thank you.
Anybody got it? Please.
Hi, my name is Patrick van Wersch with the European
Could you
Institute.
speak up, please?
My name is Patrick van Wersch. I'm with the European Institute. I was just wondering if you could reflect on the likely impact of the perceived outcome of the reforms on international defense trade in general, but defense trade with the NATO allies in Europe in particular. And just as an illustration, I believe that India recently announced that it wouldn't buy fighter jets from America, but is rather looking towards buying Euro fighters or the French Rafale fighters. Do you think that reforms would change that in the future? You think that would? Just your thoughts on that.
In the India case, I think they've subsequently explained it was not related to export control issues. It related to larger political issues, and in general, because the U.S. has been the country that's been doing most of the broadly based modernization of its platform inventory. Its share of the defense market has been growing in the past decade. And in some markets, the characteristics of U.S. equipment probably won't be acceptable, but in an increasing number of markets, because the U.S. defense market itself is focused on this system of systems integrated approach, the U.S. defense products have been very well accepted in the market, and I think that's likely to persist for the next several years.
Wait till the microphone comes forward.
Sorry.
Yeah, here we go.
Is the export control reforms are taking a multilateral approach, unilateral, or mixed? What is the approach the U.S. government, the policy? Is it multilateral, or is it unilateral, or?
Well, I think we are first making an effort to get our own house in order and to create a system that makes common sense here. There may well be ramifications for that for some of the multilateral control regimes. In that context, we'll go to the control regimes with proposals for changes in the list there. But our first order of business was simply to get our own act together with what needs to be controlled and subject to what kind of licensing requirements.
Hi, Joel Johnson, Teal Group U.S. Crest and General Mercenary, having
had spent about as many years as Bill with my associated scar tissue and export controls.
Is the microphone on?
Comment on a question. On the least likely thing to happen, obviously, is the singularities will be the agency, but I would just point out that I think goes all the way back to Jake Garn wanted to do this, 20, 30 years ago. And from an industry perspective, you really have to ask the question, do you want a standalone agency of cops? Insofar as where they are located now, Commerce, State, DOD, all have interest in having things happen as well as not having things happen. The danger of a standalone enforcement agency is they have the same enthusiasm for making things happen that, you say, parking enforcement people have for worrying about the merchants on the street. So I think you'll find industry to be somewhat unenthused about this. Question that I've seen no reference to, the State Department system currently is largely financed by the private sector based on the number of licenses you've had the previous year. If you take out 80% of the licenses, has anyone given any thought? And what's left are the ones that are hard. I mean, the beauty for State is those spare parts for the Royal Dutch Air Force take about 30 seconds to decide, but you get the same income that you get from UAE Block 60 F-16s and full armaments. Now, if you have nothing left but the hard stuff, has anyone thought about how you finance the State Department?
I'm sure the State Department has. I actually don't know the. I actually don't know the answer to that, Brian. I don't know whether you want to comment on that.
Can we bring the microphone here?
We're actually scoping this out right now, and keep in mind that State for the 85,000 licenses a year it does only has about 86 people. So so we're looking at leveraging those 86 people for what's going to be shifted, and there's still going to be an interagency process for reviewing licenses, and so we are looking at that. So
I think we have time for one more question. This gentleman here on the aisle.
Thanks. Just a short one. Jim Berg, Washington Trade Daily. Mr. Froman, can you give us an indication of when this phase three will phase in or start?
The legislative phase. Well, there are a few other things happening in Congress at the moment. I don't expect legislation prior to the August recess, if that's what you're asking. Look, I think we'll have to be consulting going forward. The chair and the ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee each have their own version of legislation. We have ours, and depending on how those processes proceed, we'll be engaging with them. But in the meantime, we have an enormous amount of work to do in phase two. You know, category 7, as Bill said, is in some ways a relatively easy category, and we have 18 more categories to go. And so that'll be our focus, plus issuing the additional sort of licensing rules for the reform of the licensing procedures. But that'll be our focus for much of the next year.
If there are any additional comments that anybody on the panel would like to make, no. Although it's clear that the cooperation of the Congress needs to be involved, I do think it would be constructive for the administration to consider the broader consequences of the way technology is evolving in creating military capabilities, because as I've noted, while these changes are very much worthwhile with respect to the system we're currently managing, and it will improve its utility to the government, the fact is we have a much larger problem than that, and we really need some involvement and buy-in in the Congress in trying to reform the way we get at these problems, the same way the Defense Department has been struggling for the past several years on ways to bring the State Department and the Defense Department together on things like security assistance, where they have a shared responsibility. Well, I want to thank very much Michael Froman and William Schneider and Brant Pascoe and all of you for this discussion, and hope to see you at future Hudson Institute events. Thank you. Yeah, I know. If you can do this, it'll be impressive. Thank you for your